Gold has been used to make our money for over 2,000 years. It is universally valued and trusted. Gold became the bedrock of our economies. It was the ultimate standard of value. It helped to build the industrial world we know today, and ushered in a golden age of trade and prosperity. War and economic crisis took away its shine. People suffered for the sake of precious metal. The golden age didn't last. February 1797. Europe was at war, and Britain was under attack. A French invasion force was heading for the rugged coast of West Wales. The attackers were aiming for an unlikely target, the small fishing port of Fishguard.
French ships were seen coming along the coast here towards Fishguard. There were 4 French ships. They were spotted by a retired sailor, Thomas Williams, who identified them as being French.
The French force landed.
There were 1,400 of them on the ships under the command of Colonel William Tate, an Irish-American. They were actually known as the Légion Noire, the Black Legion, but it seems that about 800 of them were actually released convicts who'd been set out of jail in order to come and fight the British. So they were quite well armed, but not particularly well disciplined by all accounts.
The French made their way inland. The commander of the British Defence Force saw he was outnumbered.
He had at most 250 men under his command. At the time of the Wednesday evening, he probably had about 150 men that he could summon immediately. So he did not really feel able to confront 1,400 Frenchmen. So he waited in Fishguard to see what would happen and called for reinforcements.
The Black Legion looted farms for food and drink. Their discipline fell apart.
They did increasingly become intoxicated, which didn't improve matters. So we do have accounts of them stumbling around the place drunk. There's one instance where a French soldier apparently shot a grandfather clock because he thought the ticking was the sound of a musket being cocked and thought there was a soldier in the grandfather clock.
The locals fought back. One woman, Jemima Nicholas, reportedly captured 14 Frenchmen single-handed. British reinforcements arrived and the game was up.
The French surrendered on the morning of Friday the 24th of February. They had to march down in good order from Pencair Peninsula down here to Goodwick Sands, where they lined up on the beach and yielded their arms and were then taken prisoner.
In military terms, the invasion was insignificant, but its effect on the British economy was devastating. News of Fishguard reached London. The Bank of England came under financial siege.
People thought the invasion is coming, and in times of crisis, what people want is gold, they don't want paper. So people immediately started rushing into banks and changing their notes into gold. The bank's reserves, the Bank of England's reserves, were dangerously low, very quickly, down from 16 million to about £2 million. And there was a very real danger that the bank wouldn't be able to meet all its obligations.
The French were conducting clever economic warfare. By threatening the Bank of England's gold reserves, they were undermining the world's most powerful financial institution and attacking the British economy. For nearly a century, Britain had been operating on a system called the gold standard. The price of gold was fixed and acted as a yardstick for the value of everything else. The system had been formulated by Sir Isaac Newton in 1717. The great scientist calculated a price for gold that stayed constant until the 20th century. Gold held everything else in the economy in check. It promised stability. British money was either made of gold or, in the case of banknotes, could be changed into gold at any time. That meant the currency was widely trusted. For nearly a century, Britain had been building up gold reserves, thanks to a stroke of luck on the other side of the world. In South America, it seemed the Spanish had hit the jackpot. They conquered Peru with its prize of Inca gold. From one country, the Spanish more than doubled the world gold supply. With such riches, they were happy to leave neighboring Brazil to the Portuguese. But this vast country had its own treasure. At the end of the 17th century, gold was found in Brazil.
There were massive gold discoveries in Brazil, much, much larger than Spain had had in the 16th century, far greater than we'd ever seen before in the whole history of gold. The gold went from Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony. It came to Portugal. The Portuguese bought a lot of British woolen goods. That was paid for by the Brazilian gold. So suddenly you have a situation in which, in a sense, there is enough gold for England to go on a gold standard. There is enough gold for a lot of people to have gold coin in their pockets.
This influx of gold also enabled the Bank of England to keep its promise on banknotes. Effective paper money was important in making the British economy so strong. But printing cash was far from a new idea. 1,000 years before, the Chinese had invented paper banknotes. But paper was cheap. If an emperor wanted more money, he could just print it. The more notes that were made, the less people valued them. And outside China, they were only worth the paper they were printed on. The Bank of England's gold added weight to paper money. Its notes were widely trusted, as long as the bank didn't run out of gold. With the panic after Fishguard, that was a real danger. The bank suspended its promise. Its notes could no longer be cashed in for gold. Britain came off its gold standard. It took over 20 years of political argument before gold resumed its place at the center of the economy. Eventually, in 1821, Parliament voted to bring back the gold standard. It was now official. Gold had a fixed value and was completely interchangeable with banknotes. A new gold coin, the sovereign, was introduced. 35 million were made in the first year alone. They showed that Britain was true to its word about basing its financial affairs on gold. But there were even bigger changes afoot. A new world was being built with the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution. Other metals, iron and steel, were forging an age of machines and mass production. The economy exploded into life and continued to grow year after year, like never before. Through all this change, gold remained steady. But as the industrial world grew, so did its need for gold. The race was on for a new supply. California in the 1840s was still wild territory. Its untouched land promised opportunity and attracted pioneers. The Sacramento Valley was perfect for settlement. It drew Johann Sutter, who left his native Switzerland to make a new life here. Sutter was an empire builder.
He found his way into the interior of California, where he established a fort, Sutter's Fort, and a large agricultural establishment that he called New Helvetia after his Swiss homeland.
New Helvetia was Sutter's private kingdom. He attracted lots of settlers and planned to become the richest man on the Pacific coast.
There was a fairly large colony, and he saw himself as essentially the feudal landlord of this colony. He was thinking in terms of the kind of feudal domain one might have had in Europe 4 or 5 centuries earlier.
James Marshall was one of Sutter's closest lieutenants. He was in charge of building a sawmill for New Helvetia. He found a spot beside the American River which was ideal. In January 1848, Marshall was working on the plot.
He looked down in the channel and he saw the sun shining off these shiny objects. At first, apparently, he thought these were quartz pebbles, or it was the angle of the sun, or perhaps the frost on the ground that made it look so shiny. But as he walked along, he realized that it was something more than that, and he ultimately, on closer examination, bent over and found this flake of yellow metal that was about the size of his thumbnail. And he'd never seen anything like it before, but he thought, well, it might be gold.
He took the metal back to show Sutter. They tested it, and it was indeed gold. Sutter wanted to keep the discovery secret. He didn't want prospectors invading New Helvetia. But word got out.
When gold was discovered in California, the news spread literally all over the world. And people were drawn from North America, from South America, from Australia, from Asia, from Europe. They were drawn from every inhabited continent, and they came to California. This is the first time such an event occurred in a relatively short space of time. Obviously, there had been migrations, there had been international trade, but for a single event to draw people from all over the world was a remarkable thing and really unprecedented in modern history to that time.
Gold fever struck. People kept coming. Very quickly, New Helvetia became a ramshackle city of squatters. For Sutter, the golden dream had become a nightmare. The gold just seemed to keep coming out of the river. It was easy to collect.
Gold has a specific gravity of 18, which means that it's 18 times heavier than a given quantity and volume of water. If this rock here is a piece of quartz, now quartz has a specific gravity of 2.6, means it's 2.6 times heavier than water, which means a piece of gold this same size is 5 times heavier than the rock. And that principle is the principle for gold panning. And you put it in the water and you shake it left to right, the gold starts to settle towards the bottom. So by shaking it and working the gold down, washing the stuff off the top, because now the gold has gone further down, you're down eventually to the bottom of the pan, and hopefully there's going to be a big nugget there.
By 1849, the gold rush began in earnest. Many fortunes were made. The discoveries in California were enormous. In the space of a few years, the world's supply of gold rose fivefold. There is still gold in the Sacramento Hills. Not enough for fortunes, but still a draw.
The question is, why do I do it? It's fun, you're outdoors, you're enjoying the sun, the peace and the quiet, the challenge of trying to find it. The gold is hidden here somewhere. It's like a treasure hunt. Where is it? Do I have the ability to find it? And then you go after it. We'll have something better than beans tonight, right?
This was a big stimulus to the world economy. It was like suddenly printing, turning on the printing press, creating a lot of money where money had not been there before, and putting into people's pockets and greasing the wheels of commerce and trade.
And nowhere did those wheels move faster than in the United States. The gold rush fired industrial growth, which built the most powerful economy the world has ever seen. Railways crossed the continent, connecting California with the cities and factories of the East Coast. Immigrants came from all over the world. The gold rush showed that fortunes could be made by ordinary people. It helped to create the American dream, however different the reality. The gold rush became global. There were further gold strikes in America. There was a gold rush in Siberia. Huge deposits were found in Australia. And then attention focused on South Africa for the biggest prize of all. For 19th century Europeans, Africa was still the dark continent. But it had gold. Africans had mined and used gold since the time of the pharaohs. After diamonds were discovered in South Africa, prospectors' attention soon turned to gold. Among the first were two brothers, Fred and Harry Struben. The brothers followed many trails in their search for gold, all of them so far false.
They started looking around for rocks that might contain gold, and they found a quartz reef, which they panned, and it contained a little bit of gold. They then had it analyzed and discovered that it contained over 2.7 kilos per ton, an enormous amount of gold, very rich. So they started mining.
What the brothers thought they'd found was a seam of gold ore called a reef.
These are the original chisel marks that were made by the miners. Of course, they were very excited and they said this was the Confidence Reef. Unfortunately, the confidence was misplaced, and after a year, they ceased to find anything at all and the place closed down.
The brothers gave up, not knowing that the farmland of the South African veldt sat on top of the biggest gold reserves in the world. A few years later, George Harrison located the reef while building a new farmhouse.
These rounded pebbles were laid down on the bed of a river about 2.7 billion years ago. And this is the main reef, one of the major gold-bearing reefs of the Witwatersrand goldfield, the largest on the planet. Up until 2002, about 50,000 tons of gold were recovered from here, or 35% of all the gold that's ever been produced. And this spot is where it all began. This is where George Walker and George Harrison discovered the main reef in 1886.
Mine shafts were sunk to follow the reef underground. To get at South African gold means going deep. Nowadays, up to 4 kilometers deep. The reef itself doesn't look like much.
This little 10 centimeter thick layer of pebbles dipping at about 25 degrees, this is the gold reef.
Just getting close to South African gold was a dangerous and expensive business. Massive investment was needed to sink the mines. But there was another problem. The gold in the reef is difficult to separate from the rock. It may have been the world's biggest gold field, but it wasn't economic to mine. Until a scientific discovery changed all the rules. By crushing the gold ore and then adding cyanide, the gold particles can be separated from the rock. The new process meant 96% of the gold from the reef could be extracted. Suddenly, this enormous gold field made sense. The change was rapid. Despite the heavy investment, new mines were sunk. South Africa's gold rush was very different from California's. Underground work was dangerous.
The conditions in the early years in the mines were pretty horrendous. Underground, people worked in conditions of extreme danger. No helmets, no boots. Many of the injuries that took place were crushed feet with rock falls and, of course, crushed heads.
Mining the gold needed lots of labor.
By about 1910, 500,000 young black men, including very young ones, young as 15, 16 years old, were working on contract in the mines under very stringent conditions.
For the hundreds of thousands of black mine workers, gold did not bring fortunes. They were segregated in compounds, paid as little as possible, and denied any rights. The compounds were the forerunners of South Africa's black townships, like Soweto. The segregation was a prototype for apartheid. Millions paid a high price for South Africa's gold. Today, conditions in South Africa's mines and refineries are much improved. It has been the world's largest gold producer for over a century. After the discovery of the cyanide process and the sinking of new mines at the end of the 19th century, production soared. In 5 years, it grew 30-fold. A quarter of all the gold mined every year came from South Africa, and production kept growing. The world seemed to be awash with gold. In the 50 years following the discoveries in California, more gold was mined in the world than in the previous 5,000 years. Some people thought there was too much gold. But humans found a use for their favorite metal. After all the efforts of bringing gold up from deep mines, most went straight back underground into bank vaults. Governments bought bullion. They wanted gold to support their economies. Britain's system of a gold standard became international. In the 1870s, most Western European countries adopted the standard. Russia followed, and in 1900, America made its commitment to gold official. The effect was dramatic, lifting the global economy. It was known as a golden age.
It meant that you could take a piece of gold anywhere in the world and get a known amount of money in exchange for it, or you could take a known amount of money and always get a stated amount of gold in exchange for it. So that gold set the standard by which currencies were judged.
Because currencies were based on a fixed value of gold, they were easily interchangeable. This made trade easier and boosted economic growth. It brought unparalleled prosperity. The Golden Age came to an abrupt end. In 1914, war broke out in Europe. It was a new and terrifying type of conflict. The industrial age had come to the battlefield. In 4 years, 8 million men died. When peace came, the world was desperate to return to old certainties. In economic life, that meant going back to the gold standard. Britain, like other European countries, had abandoned the gold standard during the war. Leaders saw its return as crucial. But reserves at the Bank of England were low. The economy was shattered. A return to the gold standard would take time. A target was set for 1925. Winston Churchill, the Chancellor, had to take harsh steps to prepare the way. He didn't want inflation to eat away gold reserves, so he raised interest rates. The cost was paid by workers like the coal miners. The high interest rates led to job losses all over Britain. Miners faced a pay cut to make the coal price more competitive. The miners refused. In May 1926, they were locked out of the collieries. 1 million men were now without any wages at all. Britain's trade unions called a general strike in support of the miners. For 9 days, the country ground to a halt. The miners didn't go back to work for 6 months. Their communities had been close to starvation. Supporters of the gold standard argued that it was all a price worth paying to ensure the security of Britain's currency and economy. But critics like the economist John Maynard Keynes were questioning gold as the answer to everything. He called gold a barbarous relic and said governments should look after their people rather than hoards of metal hidden away in bank vaults. On the other side of the Atlantic, things could not have been more different. The United States was now the undisputed world economic power. The stock market was rising at an unprecedented rate. Until October 1929, when the unthinkable happened. The market crashed. Panic set in. Fortunes were wiped out in minutes. The effects of the crash were devastating. Millions were out of work. The land of plenty went hungry. America had never experienced anything like the Great Depression. Its leaders were at a loss. The one article of faith was to hold on to the gold standard. For the president, Herbert Hoover, this was vital.
He was totally and without any misgivings devoted to the gold standard. He was a conservative, and therefore what was there was what he wanted to protect. He once said that we need gold because we don't trust governments.
But it was government action that was needed. Gold didn't feed people or give them jobs. the economic crisis wasn't lifting.
In the Depression, politicians who couldn't think their way through anything else could only believe that gold was the most important thing, while the world was collapsing around them. Here with prices going down and people losing their jobs, and all these guys could say was that if we spend money to try to overcome this, or if the government would run a deficit, try to help people who are poor and out of jobs, we'll have inflation, we'll lose gold, and the world will go down the tube.
By 1932, the people had had enough. They voted in Franklin Roosevelt on the promise of a New Deal.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work, and incidentally to assist materially in our already unmistakable march towards recovery.
Roosevelt was true to his word. His New Deal policy involved massive government spending to get America back to work. All over the United States, jobs were created, rebuilding America's infrastructure and blasting life back into the economy. Roosevelt put America back on the road to recovery. To build a new future, he tore up some of the old rules.
Roosevelt was not as devoted to the past in a religious way as Hoover had been, and the whole Hoover administration had been. They realized that if they didn't do something, the U.S. was going to go the way of Russia, that they had to do radical things.
And Roosevelt was radical with gold. He passed a law forcing people to bring any gold they held into banks and exchange it for dollars. It meant Americans had to trust the dollar, and with it the government's management of the economy. Roosevelt had sidelined precious metal in favor of the paper dollar bill. J.K. Galbraith was an economic advisor to Roosevelt. He remembers the president had no special affection for gold.
I was around at that time, believe it or not. I was in Washington at that time, believe it or not. Roosevelt regarded gold as a kind of petty passion of some of the rich and of banks. And you looked at it in moral and political terms, probably exaggerating both.
Roosevelt's medicine worked. Prosperity returned. He had challenged the supremacy of gold and won. Metal was never again going to be put before people. As America returned to normality, storm clouds were gathering again in Europe. In just a generation, the world was plunged into war again. World War II was a global conflict. 6 years of unprecedented destruction. The eventual victory of the Allied powers against Germany and Japan came at a great cost to both sides. The loss of life was huge. The fighting laid waste to whole nations. The economies of Europe, the Soviet Union, and Japan were smashed. When the troops finally came home, lessons had to be learned. While the victorious Allied leaders met to carve up the post-war political world, another conference was taking place to create a new economic order. At Bretton Woods, 44 countries rejected a universal return to the gold standard. Their agreement allowed only the world's most powerful currency, the dollar, to be tied to gold. America held 75% of the world's gold reserves at Fort Knox. This was to be the foundation of the global economy. American gold secured the dollar's value. Other currencies would fluctuate around it. The United States was acting as the world's banker. The dollar was a kind of universal currency. The US government had to run its economy sensibly to keep the rest of the world stable. Gold was the guarantee. Paul Volcker later became chairman of the Federal Reserve, the man in charge of the dollar.
The fixed price of gold was central to the framework of the system. The United States considered itself the guardian, really, of the fixed price for gold. Other currencies were linked to the dollar. They were only indirectly linked to gold through the dollar, but there was a special responsibility for the United States to maintain the stability of its own currency and its stability in terms of gold, and that conviction was very strongly held in the Treasury Department.
And the system seemed to work. The post-war years saw a boom, not a depression. Gold was no longer seen as the answer to everything. Its role was limited in a modern economic order. But by the late 1960s, American prosperity was beginning to bring its own problems. The boom years brought inflation. Prices were rising at unacceptable rates. This made life difficult for the government. The dollar was tied to gold. Room for maneuver was limited. In 1971, the crisis got worse. The president had to do something. Richard Nixon was aware of Britain's problems in the 1920s, caused by clinging on to the gold standard. He decided to take America off the standard. Under conditions of great secrecy, he prepared to address the nation over the airwaves.
America today has the best opportunity in this century to achieve two of its greatest ideals, to bring about a full generation of peace and to create a new prosperity without war.
I had been asked to write the speech for him on the Thursday or so before, and I wrote what I considered a very quick draft of a rather traditional kind of mea culpa speech, that we are going to be more disciplined, we're going to restore stability.
We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators.
Now that's got entirely changed into a speech of triumph.
There is no longer any need for the United States to compete with one hand tied behind her back.
We were freeing the United States from the strictures of the old system, the old Bretton Woods system, and that was good for the American economy, good for the United States, eventually be good for the world.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators, to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Nixon had cut the last official link between money and gold. The dollar was on its own, and so was gold.
Right, we're going to start today at 347.75.
Every day in the world's financial centers, bankers try to set a price for gold. It's known as the fix.
Deutsche seller, get 1, 2 buyer. We've got 1 for Deutsche flagging and turning a buyer. So we've got 5 buyers only. Everybody's selling 25. 25 wanted, within range, no flags, fixed. 166.30 at 35.
But even this is a voluntary system, designed to make gold transactions smoother. In reality, gold is just another commodity to be traded like crude oil or coffee. Anyone can buy and sell gold at whatever price they can agree. It can go up and it can go down. In times of crisis and uncertainty, the price tends to rise. But most importantly, when Nixon broke the link between money and gold, the world didn't end.
The economy grew, prices came down, there was a lot of unhappiness about price controls and other things, but the economy certainly did well afterwards, and he had a great election victory.
But Nixon didn't kill our love affair with gold. Demand for it as an ornament, as jewelry, is stronger than ever. The bond between humans and the beautiful metal looks unlikely to be broken. And gold is still important in our day-to-day lives. One of our oldest metals is a vital component in the most modern technology. It's an excellent electrical conductor. It never tarnishes. The electronics industry uses 200 tons a year.
In an age of high technology, if you suddenly said to a space engineer, to an electrician, okay, no gold can be used from now on, you would bring overnight a lot of the computer industry and the television industry and everything to literally to a halt until some substitute was found.
Scientists are taking another look at gold itself. Its medicinal properties have been studied for centuries.
And they say that the Chinese in about 2000 BC were the first to try and use metallic gold in medicine. It wasn't until the late 19th century, early 20th century, that real chemistry was used in the design of gold drugs. A German bacteriologist called Robert Koch, a Nobel Prize winner, who realized that you could kill the bacteria that caused tuberculosis by using a compound of gold, by using gold cyanide.
Before the discovery of antibiotics, gold drugs were an important weapon against the disease. Gold compounds are still used to treat some forms of rheumatoid arthritis.
In the research laboratories today, people are interested in trying to make new soluble gold compounds, perhaps for treating viral diseases. And there are some soluble forms of gold that can kill cancer cells. That's been shown in the last few years. They have not yet reached the clinic. There's a lot of research still to be done on gold chemistry. It's still very much an area of active research.
Research is also underway preparing for the next gold rush.
3, 2, 1. We have boosted ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Atlantis, setting in place the keystone.
In space.
What I'm holding in my hand is 4.5 billion years old. It has 10 times the concentration of gold of anything being mined on Earth today. And there are millions of these out in space, in the near-Earth asteroid belt and in the main belt.
Jim Benson is planning to mine this extraterrestrial gold.
We would fly a spacecraft to one of the 100 million near-Earth asteroids between Earth and Mars, and then very slowly land. And perhaps that's all we would be able to do the first time, is take a sample, analyze the sample. But then the next mission perhaps would go out and actually bring back a quantity, or even use a space tug to pull back a relatively small, many tons of course, near-Earth, a metallic near-Earth asteroid where it could be processed in Earth orbit, where it'd be less expensive to do.
It's an incredible challenge.
There are just tremendous fortunes and I believe even empires to be made over the next several generations. Space has infinite resources, and it's the infinite frontier.
A single asteroid could yield $80 trillion worth of precious metals.
Like King Midas, when everything you touch turns to gold, when there are massive amounts of it freely available to us, it's all over. It's all over.
But throughout history, gold has never lost its allure. When the Romans found gold in Spain, or the Spanish plundered Peru, we found a use for all the extra gold. The gold discoveries of the 19th century brought production up to unimaginable levels, but gold didn't lose its value. We still want more. Our obsession with gold has accompanied us through the ages.
It's driven men and women to extremes of action, of cruelty, of bravery, of creating beauty. Owning it was a matter of the highest importance for thousands and thousands of years, using it as a source of power and wealth.
Gold has been something that has remained constant through all our civilizations. It has been central to our religion and art. Our economies have been based on gold, for good and bad.
If one day the gold in the United States and Britain and France were silently collected up and dumped off the coast of Newfoundland, economic life would go on.
Day-to-day economic life would go on, but gold is something we turn to when events go beyond the normal. Gold is special. We prize it from the earth. It is not of our making. That means we trust it more.
When you live in a dangerous world, and if you've got to escape in a hurry and without, you grab what you can get or put in safekeeping what you think is reasonably retain some value, gold is still there.
It is your insurance policy. It's your investment against a rainy day.
It is there when all else fails. Beautiful, indestructible, universal. There is no power quite like the power of gold.